go to and collaborate with, so please pick them up on your way out. And with that, it's Angie.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you all for coming. I'm gonna get nice and intimate for our little chat, and obviously open to Q&A. We have art people. I'm assuming you are also in the arts, yes? I feel it within the energy. So just a conversation kind of about the process and about this particular show. So I'm Angie Chandler. I am the owner of Cultivating Consulting, and so we support small artists, institutions, organizations with either expanding their programming, thinking differently about how they are innovating and connecting with community. We support artist development, a variety of things. And so this work is a part of helping to increase access and visibility for historically excluded artists, but also artists with a variety of mediums. So as Robin mentioned, we are in Gallery 1. So they do shows about every 2 months. There's a different show in here. And so this was the Juneteenth slot. And so when Robin approached me to come and guest curate for Juneteenth, I kind of knew immediately as I was thinking about what themes could look like and what that conversation would look like, is that in learning art history and learning Black American history is knowing that even before enslavement, during enslavement, and after, is that Black artists were creating outside of bounds and limitations. So enslaved artists are metalworking, they're working with textiles, they're being paid small sums to create things, even while not being considered human by this country's standards, right? Always being human and always being beyond, but being considered, not even to be a person, but still finding a place for creativity. And so I knew that I wanted some textiles to be present, as that has a strong tie to New Mexico, but also to African American artists. I wanted ceramics to be present, as we have such a strong history of that, and I wanted to show that Black artists are part of those conversations. So when we're talking about those mediums here in New Mexico, remembering that there are Black artists who have come for a variety of reasons, and those who've been here for hundreds of years, and those who quickly pass through, or those who come to be inspired. Like, there are a variety of connections to this state. And so the idea of being unbound, obviously thinking about emancipation and being unbound in that sense, but also being boundless in that we have printmade pencil, we have a variety of sculpture, abstract work, we have photography behind you, we have poetry and writing. And so the idea that if you think of Black art and you are thinking in your head and already see something, it's even way more expansive than that. The idea that, one, it could be anything, and still it's also something specific. So that was the thinking behind it. So in the show, we have 9 artists who are all very different medium, very different amount of years in working in the pieces, and also a lot of different connections to New Mexico and like why they're here. And so I wanted to sort of dig into those kinds of themes. I wanted to highlight those artists. I wanted people to see beyond whatever they imagine Black art and the conversation to be about. And so we went about the work of finding artists who I had a relationship with, making some new relationships with artists, and really talking to them about why New Mexico. And I think one thing that really is interesting when we hear why people come here is the amount of folks who come for that connection with nature, right? And what is it to come to a place where you are in a single-digit percentage of existence, right? But very visible and invisible at the same time, coming to a land to receive something and instantly being drawn into these interesting conversations that exist in New Mexico, right? Because then you're an other who's come in, but you're like, whoa, not that though. I have not come with any sort of like power to take over space. I've really just come to kind of commune with space or to do something. But that becomes really complex, really interestingly. When I first got to New Mexico, I came in 2024 from Los Angeles, and people said, well, New Mexico's either gonna spit you out or it's gonna welcome you. And I said, well, that's interesting. I'll sit with that for a little bit. Because it felt like such an interesting way to, you can't call it welcome people, right? So it felt very interesting to like those to be the initial words that I received a lot of places. And I said, okay, and as a original New Yorker, like I'm used to like, we tough it out, we're gonna, okay, is that a challenge? Like I was like, I didn't know how to take what people were describing, because there is, a really interesting energy when you come, right? And so we know that that energy has been curated and cultivated by our native communities that's here, right? That doesn't happen everywhere. The sky, the feeling that you have here, you're like, okay. And then you also feel this harshness to the ground, right? The ground is impenetrable in some ways. And so then culturally, it also feels impenetrable for people. And so there are folks who have come to want to be in that space of isolation that it kind of allows you when you are invisible. If nobody's looking for me here, maybe I can go in the woods and work on something. One of the best parts of this show was picking up artwork from our amazing artists, some of who are joining us, and that's really exciting. But to see the studios that these artists all around us created here in New Mexico. We know financially, the cost of real estate here makes it really possible for artists to have studio space here where it might be difficult in a different kind of city. And so the fact that they can be here, they can have an expansive amount of land and place to work. And for the most part, people are gonna leave you alone, right? But what I want you to also take from the conversations is that a lot of us are still here and not being left alone, right? Like, so we are here making and living and feeling with an undercurrent of resistance to our presence. So there is a bit of unwelcoming that exists, and at the same time you'll hear, like, you know, come to the land of enchantment, and we're like, well, we too would like to come and be enchanted. Are we allowed to be enchanted here? And what is that for artists to wrestle with the idea of wanting to be carefree and enjoy nature and be one with what is here in New Mexico, and also still feel unwelcomed at times? And so there is an undercurrent of that happening in some of the conversations of the art. And then you also have folks who came because they have opportunity, right? So here we have Stephanie J. Woods, who is a professor at UNM, a practicing artist. She has right now in the Smithsonian. At the same time she was here, our show opened. She also had a feature in the Times, right? And so people are like, you're based where? You're based in Albuquerque. I don't even know what to do with that. And that becomes an interesting conversation because you're like, well, I'm a professor who wants to be able to continue to make my work. I want to tell stories of Black tradition. I want to explore themes of Blackness, and I'd love to teach in your department about sculpture. And where is going to be a place that I can do that? For a lot of people in New Mexico, UNM, spaces that are here, II, St. John's, different places of academia bring folks here for a freedom that New Mexico has fought really hard to have. So there are all these interesting things happening because the independent spirit of New Mexico and its separation from some of the things happening on the coast or other places does allow for a freeness, but it's not a freedom at no cost, right? It's a freedom that comes with, for me, being here since 2024, you feel like you are at a tension and a resistance almost everywhere. I feel it more in parts of New Mexico than I do in all of them, but then there'll be moments where I'm like, oh, that was a hard day and a weird experience. Wow, what's the sky doing? That's crazy. I've literally never seen that happen, and that makes the day a little better, right? A cotton candy sunset on the Sandia. I'm just like, whoa, yeah. I can deal with maybe that if this is the thing I have at the end of the day, right? Like if this is the thing that's nourishing me. And so that's been a story. We have right behind you all an artist who's currently based in Roswell, who came for the Roswell residency. And so the work on the outside is photography work that she was thinking about. One of those pieces connects directly to Juneteenth, and that is Galveston soil and seeds that person is holding in their hands, but is able to live in Roswell and work in Roswell because it is affordable, because they were at the residency. They can make work, they can travel, and then they can explore new mediums. So the cyanotype piece in the middle is new for them, right? That's something they've been able to explore since being here. So in the short amount of time that I've been here, I've met one of the most creatives I've ever met in square miles, right? Like you can't throw a stone in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and not meet someone who is making something. I think one of my first really funny experiences was going to the dentist, and he's doing his dentist stuff, he's working, and he somehow sees where my day job is, and he goes, I've got one of those pieces. Love to talk to you about that. He's in my mouth. He's doing dentistry, and he had a lot that he wanted to say about artwork. I went to get glasses, and the person was emailing me a resume because the glasses seller was also an art maker. And so there are so many people who have come to New Mexico. So there are Black people who have come to create. There are all kinds of people who have come here. So there's something really interesting happening with New Mexico in that it's drawing folks, but not always that drawing, you know, who's doing it? Is it energetic? Is it physical? And how does that feel? And what I love is that artists aren't shying away from that in these conversations. And so if you read their artist statements, or if you read their bios and think about how they got here, there have been really interesting stories. And so one of our artists is here. I'm just gonna wave at you, don't have to say anything, but when I first saw Onita's work, I was incredibly moved, one, by the micaceous clay, and then in that piece is engraved Black Lives Matter. And I said, all right, if I'm gonna explain anyone Black art in New Mexico, I got micaceous clay, and I have Black Lives Matter on one piece. Like, nobody else is even understanding what's happening with that. One day would just see a pot and go, shiny pot, that's lovely. Did you add that glitter? Like, someone would literally ask that somewhere else, but realizing the volcanic history of the soil and learning more about the clay, then that takes people into a journey into New Mexico proper, right? You are learning from Tewa artists, you are thinking about New Mexico soil, and yet that etching is incredibly powerful, and it really, to me, says we are here. And so if you are telling a story about New Mexico and you are not including the 4% that are in Albuquerque of Black folks who are making and living and being, the 1% in Santa Fe, you're still missing a part of that story. I'm not saying we're the main part of that story, but we are present and have been here. Some of the folks who are present, I'm trying to think of who has the longest lineage, because we have the 1970s, but there are some folks, but they're not in the show because Gwen is also not that long. It could be between but it could be Onita, who has the longest connection to New Mexico. But in other conversations, interestingly enough, I've met folks who've got a few hundred years, right? So like Nikisha Breeze was able to trace her family back to Blackdom. You have folks who have an El Paso border connection, a really interesting story of a woman whose father was Afro-Mexican working in Las Cruces to do medical work for folks who couldn't get treated in Texas. And so her family goes back hundreds of years, right? So while we weren't here in large numbers, we've always been here, been a part of the community. One of the most important pieces that we really fought to have in the show is that Sounds of Black Albuquerque, which talks about what Juneteenth was like here in Albuquerque in the 80s, right? If you are a person like me who has come to New Mexico for a job opportunity, and you're like, what a lovely backdrop to do work in. I shall be here and do my work and mind my business. You have not maybe dug into the history, right? To realize that, no, there were Black folks who've been here and we're making and we're singing and we're on the squares around the city doing things at a time where people still forget New Mexico's a state. That's always a good time. When people are like, so you live where? Wow, Angie, I knew you were Afro-Latina. I didn't know you spoke Spanish. I live in America. New Mexico is a state in this country, and for some people in 2025, 26, that is still like a revelation. So it was really easy for folks to forget that, one, people were here, two, that there were some Black folks who were here between the Great Migration movement. Some people stayed, and what that looks like to have folks who've been here from the 70s and 80s. So in that reporting, you hear the sound of the crowd. You hear people who are still involved in Albuquerque currently, families and professors who were there leading chants and leading choirs. And I was like, wow, because for Santa Fe Juneteenth, which recently, I think 2020 is when they began celebrating on the plaza itself, and there was an incredible amount of friction to bring that celebration to the plaza in Santa Fe for Juneteenth. And then to hear the history and realize that, well, in Albuquerque, they had been having celebrations on the plazas, at the fairgrounds. I was like, now, wait a minute. This is really interesting, right? This space between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And so I work in Santa Fe for my daytime work, and I live in Albuquerque. That's been super interesting. I was always coming out to Albuquerque, but now that I live in both places, or I work and I live in one place, I'm getting such an interesting like listening of how people feel or what the real differences are in culture and institutions. For me, I think you have the churches, you have the businesses that were in Albuquerque that allow for folks to create some more spaces and institutions of community versus Santa Fe, which has a smaller batch of those. And so I'm guessing maybe there was another time in history where Santa Fe had a more public Juneteenth experience, but we couldn't find it in the research. So I love that we were able to find at least that audio from the 80s to remind people that it existed and it was here. And some of those folks are still here. And that's been really interesting. So in putting the show together and having conversations with artists, my real big takeaways were definitely this idea of space and studio being possible here, this idea of possibility, which feeds into what we're saying about boundlessness, this tension between folks who are finding a freedom and a carefreeness here, and a little bit of tension in terms of how we're received, depending on, you know, your spheres that you're hanging out with. And then thirdly, this idea that there's so many different kinds of art making happening in New Mexico, happening with these artists who are either here for life or here for a short time. But even in that short time, there is influence from being here that then comes out in their work. I see a little bit of that in Stephanie's piece, with obviously the background is, to me, reminiscent of our son here, right? But the watermelon and the sandcastle, those are things she's already been working with these themes and thinking about that. But then that goldenness of that background, that's kind of little New Mexico too. Like it seeps in, right? The textile, the beads, the colors of New Mexico, which was definitely one of the things about Gwen's pieces, because that's that circular, what you're seeing happen in that piece is reminiscent of the ring shout, which also takes us all the way back to enslaved times and the ways that we communicated and sang and chanted and prayed. But that background looks like New Mexico, that sky and that sand. So the idea of seeing a ring shout set against what looks like a New Mexican background was another one of those moments similar to seeing Onita's pot, in that this to me is Black New Mexico, right? It's the idea that we are bringing our culture, we are bringing our social politics, we are bringing our joy for life, which we have in Shirley's poem, but we're bringing it here and kind of marrying it to what the New Mexico experience is bringing. If it's bringing peace, if it's bringing a connection to nature, if it's bringing more of a rootedness back to our culture, it's doing something for you, and then that's coming out in the work in really interesting ways. So love a little more conversation and some questions and thoughts, but those are definitely the three themes that were with me as I was thinking about the artists in the show. Each piece is really important in terms of why it's here. The piece behind me is a quote from Pauli Murray. For me personally, Stephanie and this quote brought in North Carolina. So Stephanie and I met in North Carolina. Pauli Murray was based in Durham. And to be in New Mexico and find anything that feels familiar, I'm like, oh, I feel seen, I feel present, I feel alive in a way that is really hard when you're so far away from your cultural center. So Stephanie and I had a beautiful full circle moment. We go back to 2016, talking to Karen and being like, seeing Pauli Murray's name outside felt so important. This was up during Pride. Pauli Murray's an incredible figure in Pride history that a lot of people don't realize. One of the first genderqueer religious figures who is doing activism, writing, and doing all of these things in the South and around the country. So I'm like, yes, please, we would love that piece to be here. I want more people to learn these names and to Google and to research what's happening. And so those were the things we were thinking about. We wanted to do something different in terms of what it was like. We still have themes of Juneteenth in it, but we also have this exploration of what it is to be unbound, what it is to be boundless and to never fit in categories. A lot of our artists are multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, and it's important for folks to know that they have that freedom, right? That is a version of what freedom looks like. So we'd love some more conversation about things or any questions. I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'm going to let you volunteer to share if you would like.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm a New Mexico Santa Fe resident since 1973 from Chicago. And Santa Fe has a large expatriate Chicago contingent.
Specifically, yeah.
And it's one of those things where you, initially when I first moved here, whoa, where is everyone? And everyone was Black people, and they were nowhere to be seen. And then the longer I was there, the more I was able to Oh.
I think I see somebody.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
I think I see someone.
Oh, it's nice to meet you. What are you doing? That whole community building, which is what this represents, is community and the building of it, and connecting the dots that you have always known were there, but you don't know how to bring them together. And so the value of this show, and there was a show in Santa Fe, multiple Black artists for Black History Month, Shortish Month, Coldest Month, celebrating and creating its own heat. But that coming together of these artists in such a small, it's a very vibrant and vital community, but it is small, and there's a real intimacy that develops from having so few active participants or known participants, because everyone is not wearing a sign that says, "Hi, I'm an artist. Can I get you anything?" You know, you're waiting on tables and you're an artist. Do you want fries with that?
Do you feel like in the different, I moved here in '89, and there were very, very few Black people in Santa Fe at all, it
Yeah.
felt like. And now it feels like there's been an influx, and there's a much,
Still only 1,100. They're literally 1,100, and
but that's a lot more than 11.
it's still, I guess, coming from places where there is a more concentration of Black culture. Like, yes, you can see a few more. At this point, I say I know 500 of them, and I'm very curious if the other 500 live in Santa Fe full time. Because some on that census, that last census that gives us that 1% out of that 100,000 are people, like, I know people who have second homes here who are Black folks, right? So there are a few that I will see, you can see them at different points, but I know where they work. I know there's a guy at Trader Joe's, checking on him, you doing all right? You can see folks who've come in, and you've seen it grow and develop.
I've seen it grow, and I've seen a few insults and a few racial slurs
1,000%.
in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Yeah.
And I'm always, you're talking to me.
Right.
You don't know anything about me. Don't get any closer. One of the things about the art being a collective, being a community, is that it is not, there's a lot of subtlety to this. It is not just the happiest Negroes you've ever seen.
Right.
It is not just, oh, look at that amazing work. How did they do that? Because there's a they about it. And it is, I think it's a universal in this country, and it is one that is being given enormous position and I'm trying to say permission, but position works too from our central government that is not interested in this kind of presentation of a disenfranchised community. So the strength here is, as amazing as the work is, it is not all user friendly, and it is not apologetic. And there's so many things that it's not, that the strength of what you're looking at takes a while to recognize, because it's just interesting. And it's more than interesting, it's compelling if you really look, and that's what the tightness of this gallery, the intimacy of it, really speaks to the kind of work that's being shown here.
I want to echo something you were just saying about the central government and their lack of interest. I would go a step further and say their actual opposition to just our presence. And I would say that that's kind of one good thing that has come out of a lot of the aggression and the violence towards Black people, is that it has forced us to come more together. It forced the Black Lives Matter movement. It forced people here, you know, we
To have
can't
those
hide out.
conversations.
We can't hide out
Yeah.
anymore. You know,
Yeah.
we have to find where each other are and be here and be in solidarity with one another and acknowledge who our allies are, like true allies. So that's a good thing, I would say, that has come out of a lot of the, violence against, Black people. And then from my own experience, I came here in 2014. I was a retired teacher, born in Florida, raised migrated to Brooklyn,
Yes,
raised in Jersey,
Yes.
and grew up in Philly,
Okay.
and then I was how would I say, I call myself a climate refugee.
Okay.
Because I lost my home to Hurricane Sandy.
Wow.
And the first time I came to New Mexico, I followed friends who had flooding in their house the year before, but they knew New Mexico because they had family here. And they said, come on out to New Mexico, I think you really like it. So the first time I came, it's like, oh, God, it's so dry and you know, it's
My skin.
too
My
brown.
skin
I
is
can't
so
deal with it.
confused.
Exactly, my
Yeah.
skin, my hair, whatever.
But no
But
flooding
then-
from the ocean.
Exactly, but then after I went back home and got flooded and lost my home of 50 years, I said, a place with no water might be the best place for me to come. So I came here, and I remember for several months I was really depressed because I wouldn't, this is Albuquerque, I've always lived in Albuquerque. I would never see black people anywhere, and one day, and then when I did see them, often we didn't give each other
Right.
the nod. We weren't
No.
connected.
Or
Now,
somebody
black
would
folks here
raise
got
their
that.
nose
Yeah,
when
black
they
folks
saw
here got a
you.
reputation about that, but I think
Yeah.
it's changing. But in any case,
Hopefully.
I remember seeing 7 black people in one day. I cried. I was so happy. I
Yeah.
called like 5 or 6 people back east. I said, I saw 7 black people today.
Counting, like you
And
can
yeah,
count.
And so, but
Yes.
having been here, you know, I see the growth in the community. I see more cohesiveness. I guess I have to acknowledge some of our elected officials as
Mhm.
well, you know, to try and bring us together. And I just wanted to say 2 quick things about one of my pieces, both of my pieces.
Can you
and that
tell
is-
them your name? Because
Oh,
Robin's also
I'm sorry,
recording.
I'm Gwen,
Yes.
Gwen Triai Sanders.
Yes.
And the first piece right here, I call it Hush.
Yeah.
Somebody's calling my name, but if you know anything about the Negro spirituals and the Baptist church, this is a song that's still sung, and it actually depicts a hush harbor. So
Oh.
while they thought we were just like, you know, good Negroes, like praising the Lord and all that, we were actually singing in codes, you know, to plan our rebellions. So it wasn't technically called a ring shout, but it is a similar to the tradition of the ring shouts in the
Gotcha. Thank you
Gullah
for that.
Nation. And then the one Sankofa, which, that's so important to me because Sankofa is an Adinkra symbol, and those are symbols that were given by the Ghanaian kings to their people to teach them moral and spiritual lessons. And there's actually 2 different Sankofa symbols, but one is the Sankofa bird. So you see, the bird is looking back. Sankofa means go back and get it, or go back and fetch it. So the idea is that you can't move forward unless you look back and know your history. So the bird's body is facing forward and his feet are facing forward. And what I want to say with that, and with another piece that I did, I think it's important to acknowledge that we were here before Columbus. There were many, many, many black people here. And all of that history has either been hidden, you know, how can I say, intentionally, or trying to be erased, you know, and I think it's really important. Even the whole history with Esteban, and, you know, there were many black people came. Mansa Musa came here and explored this whole area. He was the wealthiest man in the world from Africa. And we don't know about this. Like, even many of the native peoples, you know, after a certain amount of time, you know, they kind of lightened up the race a little bit, but back in those days, many of the native folks were
Darker.
very
Yeah.
dark, you know, dark people. And so that's one thing that I'm very interested in as an artist, to pursue this idea even more of the fact that we came before Columbus. And I'd like to see some of that being reflected in the work of artists here, artists and historians.
And doing that research. And I think Robin and I both saw the Sankofa bird when you shared it with us, and that idea of going back, of calling back, of even as we move forward, still remembering to celebrate all the different generations who have been here, right? Like, we might have never heard that New Mexico was a place we could go if Miss Onita hadn't come in the 70s. Right? Or if you hadn't come to know, like, hey, there's somebody there and they're still okay, they're still doing all right. And have those conversations about history. I always tell people that we come to these places within a certain chapter in that book, and it's important for us to go back and to learn other chapters. And people, I guess it's us in the art world to do some of that work. You know, some people don't have the luxury of time to do that research, but for us to do it and to tell those stories, incredibly important. I appreciate that reminder.
One last quick thing I do
Yes,
want to say
please.
is that I grew up in Broadway, New Jersey,
Mhm.
okay? That's like kind of north central. And one of my mother's best friends, my mom was very active in the NAACP, and this woman, Miss Shirley Palmer, she actually was from Hobbs, New Mexico. And I remember her telling me about this. I was like a teenager. She's telling me all about New Mexico, and I was like, well, you know, are you gonna go back? Oh, I'd never go back to New Mexico. Her experience here was one of a lot of racism and, you know, difficulty growing up, you know, a lot of colorism as well. And so I guess I was always curious about New Mexico, but I knew it was part of the United States.
Yeah, at least good.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Gwen. Thank you for letting us have your pieces in the show. It's been super important to
I'm
share.
honored. Thank you.
Yay. Anybody else? Thoughts or thinking or comments? There's so much we could say. There's so much we could say. My personal artistic practice comes out of the Black art movement, right? Like the folks who taught me were either babies or teens rather at that time and continued that tradition. And so in all of my consulting work and all of my work with artists, it's deeply rooted in this idea that our art can always and has always been more. Because I'll tell people, like, you don't have to have anything political in your piece for you to not be political. Our actual presence in the art world, our presence in New Mexico, wherever I go, is political. I show up here at City Hall to come and see the fine folks at Public Art. People are like, huh, now why is that? Oh, okay, so she seems to know where she's supposed to be, and she's allowed to be here in that way, right? Like, just my presence in certain spaces, one, is letting like the college folks that we had in the space earlier today know that that's possible, that you can meet a curator who is a Black woman, you can meet artists who are a variety of, from so many places, doing so many different things, and like that is a part of the legacy of the Black arts movement, right? This idea that just our physical presence is political, and that the art in so many different ways is political, right? This way that Stephanie is subverting the use of watermelon and bringing it back to it being one of our agricultural greats and cash crops that was important for Black people before it was a stereotypical figure, right? She is playing with the watermelon and hair in all these different ways. That is a part of it, right? If you hear Shirley read her poem, right, that is akin to the way that we use poetry within those conversations to tell stories and to just do things in the way that culturally we do them, which is a variety of things, but it always has flavor. I can tell people, like, we're not a monolith, and yet there is some similarity, there is some flavor, there is something that we bring into the space, and it is a fought for joy. It is a joy in the face of resistance. There were some people who think there was no racism here. And I'm like, I've had 20, 40 microaggressions in my first year here in New Mexico. I've also seen interesting throwback racism, where I'm like, hey, I think we got rid of that is that still happening here? Like, I mean, people physically petting, like the idea of physically touching is very constant here. And please don't touch my Juneteenth shirt to tell me you like it. That's actually super awkward. And so there are these really interesting things, and at the same time, us creating and making, either in response to what we're experiencing, as an outlet to transverse that, to move past it. That is what I see all of these different artists doing. It is the most interesting group of 9 people. And I think each of them brings such an interesting story in terms of why they're here, you know, what they came to do, what being here has done to the artwork. And I don't know if you have anything about that, Gwen, and you're thinking of your work. Is there New Mexico, or has being here done anything to shape your work?
Well, first of all, I was in a few shows and craft fairs kind of thing back east, but I came here mostly because I was just devastated from, you know, being a climate refugee. Mm-hmm. But after I got here and I saw that there were so many people creating art, like, I have to, you know, really agree with what you said, that people don't look at you weird if you're just all day long. If I'm not eating or sleeping, I'm making something, you know? And so that kind of gave me a boost, you know? I remember the first time I came here, I met a woman, I don't know if you know, Annie Gillespie. She's an elder, has been here from Chicago for years. Annie's in her 80s. And we met in an African dance class, which I was shocked to find. And first thing she said to me was, "Hey, how are you? I'm Annie, I'm from Chicago. Are you an artist?"
Wow.
And I was like,
Wow.
how'd you know? And so she said, yeah, because we have a pavilion in the State Fair, an African American artist pavilion, and we need more people to put in work. And that's kind of how I got started. So I put my first pieces in 2016. I think I put 16 pieces in.
Wow.
I was so happy. And actually, that year, I won a purchase award and a first place award, and the piece was added to the State Fair permanent art collection. And I was like, whoa, you know, I'm a real artist now. You know, I wasn't just like a quilter or just like sewing clothes or whatever. I began to feel that I was validated here as a creative and as an artist here in New Mexico. And I've put work in the State Fair ever since. And that was the first time that they actually bought work from the African American Pavilion. So it was really quite instrumental in shaping me as an artist. And of course, I think the beauty of the landscape, the sky. I remember I would ask New Mexico folks that said they had moved away for a while. I said, well, what happened? Why'd you come back? And almost always they said, I miss the sky. I thought that was weird, but I began to feel that way because when I would travel back east, I couldn't see the sky, and there was always the rain and, you know, the pollution and too many trees. And then when I come back, and as soon as I get off the plane, I say, oh, the sky.
It's beautiful.
So, you know, you really feel here in some ways, not that there isn't racism. I've experienced my share of racism. Now and then I'll braid my hair and I get people all up in my hair and I'm like, please, you know. But for the most part, I do feel that I was validated, you know, as an artist and, you know, able to take part in the beauty, because for me, although almost all of my work does have a political meaning, but I try to have it where that's not the first thing people see, because we're more than our struggle. We're beautiful as well. And so I want people to look at my work and say, oh, that's so pretty, that's so beautiful. And then ask me what it's about and what it means.
And that's also for me, Hannah's skins, these bronze skins,
Yes.
which I first saw, and we did mention in my curatorial statement, I shout out the Truth, Memory, Joy and Resistance show from Santa Fe, which is where I saw first Gwen and Onita and Hannah's work, and it was a larger version of the skins. And to me, I'm always in places looking for signs of Black life, right? And so there's something about the bronzeness of these pieces that just took me somewhere visually, and it definitely took me back to something that felt very grounded in that thing about our skin glistening in the sun, which is like just one of my favorite things to see. And to just also remind people that we make abstract work, right? Like we make work that is narrative and it's gonna tell you a story, and that we're also in the abstract art world. I've been in the art world for about 20 years. And it still surprises me how many of my colleagues have not heard of the most known Black contemporary art people, right? Like there could be a person who is extremely famous inside of the Black art world and folks have never heard of them. Or if they are thinking of they're gonna do a show, they can't see us beyond who we are to realize that if you're talking about quilting and textiling, go ahead and put Gwen Samuels in that conversation. You're having a conversation about fine art photography, you should also be thinking about artists like Nina Robinson, right? The idea that we are telling this specific story about the Black experience, and we're still a part of the larger American story and the larger African diaspora story and the larger contemporary art and modern art conversation. And for some people, it's an either or. And I think the other thing I want to challenge with this show is to remind folks that we belong in all of the conversations. We belong in all the conversations, and I'm happy that we weren't in February, because we should have a show in February and we should have a random show any other time. So right now in New Mexico, we have this fascinating moment. We have this show that happened in Santa Fe in February. We have our show in June, and then our show opened actually late May. And right before this show closes now, Albuquerque Museum has the Woods Before Sunrise, which is several Black artists also blowing the idea of bounds and boundaries and categories out the water. And so now there is a year where there are 3 major shows of group shows of artists with firm, undeniable connections to New Mexico, making a variety of artwork. And so the idea that they go boom, 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 and you almost have your time where there was not a time where there wasn't Black art up, Santa Fe, and then we have these two in Albuquerque. That really encouraged me. Seeing all of your studios when I picked up the artwork for the show. That's like my favorite day. It's hard here, y'all. Let me stop my video. We're gonna edit there, but it's hard here. And so the joy of seeing Karen's studio on the outskirts of Espanola. She's a farm. She has a studio with ceilings so high that it was higher than some public studios I've ever seen. The ceilings are like 30 foot high or something. It's insane. And then there's animals. I was like, you better be out here on a farmland making artwork in the middle of New Mexico. Nobody even knows that this is possible, right? Like, she is a possibility model, right? I'm not gonna embarrass you, but picking up Miss Onita's piece and realizing that I could have picked up 20 more. I'm not gonna put you out there, okay? But you know, to be walking into a home filled with artwork by a living artist, and the pieces were everywhere, and they were all stunning. It could have been a pottery show.
They were not online.
But the ones I liked were.
The richness of New Mexico is
Yeah.
you can hunt and gather, and you can hunt specifically. I want black artists.
Hello.
Or you can just kind of casually, oh, look at that. There is no apology for any of the work in this room.
It all stands and exists.
And it's also not being mashed in your face as if you, ignorant serf that you are, you couldn't possibly understand that. That's not what this is. And that's why there's a certain level of joy in it. Because you're really sharing. You're sharing what you have, and all are welcome to share.
I love that you are talking about the politics of black art. We are based, going back almost 60 years since the Afro-Cobra movement, of our works tied to the politics in America. Should we be concerned with the current state of prominent black artists, Jay-Z, Pharrell, Dwayne Johnson, trying to depoliticize black art by saying, oh, we should only be judged by our own excellence, that I don't want to discuss politics in my work?
I think that's so interesting. I can speak on Jay-Z specifically as a Brooklynite, right? As I see Jay-Z saying some things, and his music and the way that they move economically saying something else. And I think that is interesting. Also, people having a platform who were never really thinking about some of these things ahead of having wealth, that becomes a really interesting conversation, which is why I'm always like, I want to bring youth through. I want to talk to college people. I want to talk to athletes and rappers. I know people from all over arts and entertainment, because you have to get people to understand their importance in this work and this world and in the legacy of black art and entertainment before they get on, before they make money. Because once money and capitalism is a part of the equation, the thoughts are skewed. They're also skewed by the bubble of people that's around them. And so, like, to me, in the back of him, growing up in Marcy Projects, his mom being who she is, the things he knows, his nemesis being Nas, who reads everything, means that he knows stuff. And you can hear some of that in, like, the 444 album. This is 30 Years of Reasonable Doubt. You listen back and you hear the politics of the drug war. You hear, though, a lot of capitalism. You hear a lot of desire for wealth. And so that was really what was more important to him. He reminds me of so many of my family members that are aware of more things that they should be and who they should show up to be in the community. And yet the idea of making it out of the hood, the idea of making it, being a business person, that is extremely important to Jay-Z, and he wants to be in those circles, right? That became more important, and I'm gonna throw a few sprinkles in here of Black history. Like, if you would listen to any of the lyrics, even on the joint album with him and Beyonce, they clearly are still reading, or at least Solange is reading to them. I don't know who's reading, right? Someone's reading to them. They're still watching documentaries and knowing and thinking things, but the business side of things is what shines more. And he's gonna put a few splashes of things for the culture in that way that we're talking about Black Arts Movement and Afro-Cobra are still gonna be present, but very low volume compared to other people. I can't speak to, I don't know how The Rock was raised. I can't speak to Dwayne. I don't know what was happening there. And who was the other person you mentioned? Pharrell's, that's super, we don't have the time. We don't have the time. We don't have the time for Louis Vuitton, Don Pharrell, or for, I think the Swiss Beats, and we've personally have had the Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys conversation. Their show Giants is currently in San Diego. And while that's a complicated couple and set of people, that is the biggest Black art show to be in San Diego. That is the most artists to have ever been shown there. Now the San Diego Museum of Art has an Axe Line talk that goes back like 20 years. It's their most important talk, fancy as heck. They are having Derek Adams. Derek Adams doesn't become the speaker for the San Diego Museum of Art, which like owns like 4 pieces of Black art, without Giants being at the Contemporary Art Museum. And that happened because of them bringing their artwork out of their house and out of their storage area to show it to people. So if you're gonna have that much money, yes, please buy these pieces. And then also don't leave them at home. Take them out so people can see them. So to me, I can argue for the benefit of that. Pharrell, I don't have anything on Pharrell for right now.
But we can't depoliticize Black art.
He could try. It's really not possible. And what he's doing, like, because he knows it matters that he is in the positions that he is, and it is a part of a larger conversation and a legacy. So I'm not playing no games with Pharrell. I don't have the time. So yes.
I have a question which I think is somewhat related to what Robin is asking. You know, when I first found out about the show in Santa Fe, I was torn because I really didn't know what pieces to submit.
Yeah.
Because my experience has been that when I would submit pieces to, like, say, certain galleries here in Albuquerque, if it was very political or too outspoken, it was always rejected.
Wow.
And then when I didn't know Jakia at the time, and I didn't know Aaron, and so I submitted this piece because I thought it was saying something, but at the same time it was a little mellow, you know. And then when I got there and I saw Allison's piece with the Freddie Gray quilt, I was like, dang.
Oh, I could have gone there.
Yeah,
I could have gone there.
Because I had a piece that I did that was, I called it View of Heaven from My Window, and it was the attic windows quilt thing, but it didn't really say a lot in words, but it had a lot of like charms on it. For example, a $20 bill, a Skittles pack, a hoodie, 9 Bibles. You know what I'm saying? Like, and it represented in each square. I represented victims of police violence. And as a matter of fact, it was in the show that the Women of Color Quilters Network did at the Textile Center back in 2020. It was a show called We Are the Story, A Visual Response to Racism. And Carolyn Maslumi, who runs that, had put that quilt in her book. And so I was like, wow, I could have submitted that piece. And sometimes I don't really know like how it's gonna be received, and I'm reluctant to put in things that are beautiful and pretty at the same time, but they're very strong in the message. And I think that's sometimes a dilemma for Black artists, you know?
Grateful for people like Robin, who is working with the city and it still allowed me to kind of think through what I wanted this show to look like and didn't give us any of those bounds, especially after going to name it Bound to Boundless. I was happy that we didn't have to take anything back. And then to the folks in Santa Fe at the city, Arts and Culture, to Chelsea and her team, and Charla, who's no longer in Santa Fe but was instrumental in that show existing, to give people the freedom to create. Like a lot of that stuff, and it's similar to what I'm talking about with Derek Adams being at the talk in San Diego, is that without some of us being in those positions and being in those rooms, some of that doesn't change. But then having conversations with our colleagues, right? And making sure that when I'm talking to people, I'm talking about capital B Black art and the fact that it's gonna look like a variety of things in all of the spaces I'm in, right? So in the spaces where I'm the only Black person in the room, and in the spaces where it's all Black folks or BIPOC folks of color. And you have to begin to break down those walls and what is behind the fear. What is behind the thing, or how am I making the artist feel unsafe or concerned about what they're submitting? And I'm doing something wrong, right? Or I'm bringing artists into a place where it's not safe for them. And as a curator, that's something you have to think about, right? Is what is the ground? What are we preparing for who we're bringing? Is it going to be even if it's received roughly, do I have their back? Am I present to be a part of that conversation and to really meet it head on? And that's the work of arts administrators, of curators, of educators, is to begin to break down those conversations of fear, to not talk about things that are happening in our society. I think it gets really interesting to have those pieces in a place like this, right? To have Cameron right there. Cameron's not doing nothing but standing in the woods. But for some people who have a lot of colorism, Cameron is a dark black chocolate man standing there. I think this looks great. I want to stare at this a little longer. Some people see that and have a little moment of fear. They got a purse clutching. Cameron's not even here. And somebody might be clutching a purse, right? But like just putting him there is knowing that for some people that could spark something in them or have a concern with them. He's not wearing a shirt. Should we be concerned? I'm glad that we didn't hear any of that kind of language here, but knowing that if I'm going to put something that is either specifically political or that can be seen as political, that I'm there to support the artists in conversation and the culture we're building and how we bring people in to talk about the art. It's so much work that goes in after having artwork on the wall. Like there's so much to make a fertile ground for that kind of show where you have straight on pieces like that.
Well, as a curator, would you welcome a contact from an artist asking about something like that? Like,
yeah,
hey, I have this piece, but I'm concerned that it's a little too deep
Yeah.
or whatever, because you know you're just torn. Like you don't really know.
I welcome that. I think that's why artist development is always a part of my consultation, because you can read between the lines of a curatorial call. I can know more about the history of a space to know, is that space even ready to have that conversation, and let you know, here, that's what that will be like if that's in there, or it's gonna be fine, they're good, it's gonna be taken care of. So that is something I'm always happy to help people evaluate and to think about.
I also think there's just a big difference between commercial galleries and nonprofit spaces. So museums, nonprofit spaces, they're gonna tend to show work that is more political, is more difficult for people. And commercial galleries, especially in New Mexico, which is the land of enchantment or fantasy, is a lot going to tourists who come here and want to get something pretty and emblematic of their fantasy of New Mexico, which
And of Americana and westward expansion, right? People are not
Right.
naming it in that way, but a lot of what folks are coming here to cosplay is a desire to be a part of that Wild West.
Right, you've got your cowboy
right?
hat or
Yeah.
your Indian jewelry
Sure.
or all sorts of things.
Your
And
faux turquoise.
the black
your
experience
faux turquoise
is not
coming
part
out.
of that cultural fantasy here.
Not for the tourists.
Not yet.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, though, I remember once, surprisingly, it was an African American fiber arts show, and they specifically told us, we don't want any George Floyd stuff and this, that, and the other. And I was like,
Wow.
they had a theme, and even though whatever we might present as artists could be connected to that theme, but still express the politics, it's like we're specifically told, no, we don't want that.
Interesting.
So it's, yeah, it could be a little scary at times.
It's evolving. It really is evolving from the time that I came and what I was looking at in Santa Fe and now. And while it may be going backwards or slipping, I think the impetus really is for improvement. It's gonna be a lot to quash this, a lot.
Question. Just listening to all of you share about your experience being in New Mexico and thinking also about, this is a place that is like a lot, it's really multicultural, right? And there's a lot of lateral violence possibly that's happening or has happened in the past. I remember being at IAIA and reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, and being with a room full of indigenous students who were like, this is the most amazing article and how are we not named here? Not once, and that's 2014. And then getting a bunch of emails for Juneteenth from like Indian Collective, different organizations that were like really naming Juneteenth as a moment to celebrate. And
This year?
yeah, and I think, you know, this year I got a lot of them, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. And feeling like maybe there's a shift in understanding like the solidarity that's possible with these multiple cultural realities in New Mexico, and conversations that can begin to weave in different ways and be supportive. And I guess my question is that part of your experience? Has that been shifting and growing for you in terms of your access or ability to have conversation inside Indigenous community and with Indigenous community, or what is your experience with that?
Do you wanna go first?
Current pottery experiences at the community college in Santa Fe, and the instructor in the classes that I've been taking is a Navajo woman, Carmelita Topaja, who was homeless at one point in the last 2 years, who has a lot of, she's an anthropologist, she was an IAI student, and that focus that she has, of course, is on her Native brothers and sisters, but I have never felt from her that I was not included as a sister. It's not my tribe, and I'm not trying to break in, but it's one that, and it's not empathy, it's recognition of your humanity, it's recognition of your art practice, it's recognition of your making things, and other people can see it, and sometimes other people's vision informs yours, and there's no closing, in my experience, or secrecy about a vision. It's laid out there. You can see it and you can figure out what you think it is, and that may be it and it may not. It doesn't really make a lot difference. But that inclusion with the Native community. The only person in New Mexico who called me a nigger was a Native American man under the palace of the governors as I was walking to work in the hospital, and I was like, what happened to you? What the hell happened to you? And how far can I get away from you? And how fast?
I think solidarity is complicated.
Yeah.
It's very complicated, and it's not one.
Yeah. I, you know, for one, let me say one thing first. I think there's a lot of healing that needs to be done between the Native communities and the Black community, because, you know, maybe there's some issues in terms of when you talk about reparations and the land, like we're here on Indigenous land, but as I said, we were here before Columbus, we were just erased. And I think a lot of understanding has to go on between the two, you know, communities. And we have to talk also about things like the Trail of Tears and the natives that owned slaves on the Trail of Tears. You know, you don't learn about that in history. The kids in middle school learn about the Trail of Tears, but they don't know that there were Native Americans that, you know, owned slaves. What I get from a lot of the Native folks here is that, like, I think I bought a shirt one time when I went to Texas. It was from the Buffalo Soldiers Museum. I was like, ooh, don't wear that in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Because there's all this animosity towards, you know, the Buffalo Soldiers. But then again, why were the Buffalo Soldiers doing this kind of thing? Because after the Civil War, they couldn't get work. They had to come out here west because it was the only way that they could make money and take care of their families. So they were doing the government's bidding, but they had to survive. So I think there's a lot of understanding that needs to take place between Blacks and the Indigenous communities. On a personal level, I have not had very good experience with individual Native Americans, in that I feel a lot of times that I have an ignorance towards Native cultures because it just was not something that was taught in the schools. I didn't understand anything about it. The Native Americans where I grew up were completely obliterated, the Lenni Lenape people, you know, so, and I think the closest ones to me might have been like in the Onondaga Nation up north New York, or the Cherokees down in North Carolina, but we never learned anything about indigenous people. And when I wanted to learn more in one of the communities that I came here and I was in at first, like, I expressed this directly. I was like, well, why don't we do something like educational about Native American culture, because I want to learn, I don't know this and that. And the response I got was as if I was being patronizing, but I was really sincere about it, you know. So I don't know, I just think that sometimes on an individual level, we're so ignorant about one another. And that ignorance is what fuels this tension between the communities. And I do feel like more work needs to be done to bring us together in solidarity, you know. The natives want, you know, their, you know, land back, and so, and I want reparations and land too. I'm not going back to Africa. Like, give us 5 to 8 states. I'm not for separation personally, but, you know, we need to learn and understand each other's experiences and needs in order to wipe out a lot of the tension that's between the two communities.
I feel that administratively, there has been a lack of cultural inclusion and certain issues that are universal in this community. And it does disturb me when you have administrators that choose to cherry pick experiences, but don't really see the broader picture of what has been done by oppression and colonialism to set us apart, that our stories are more unified than what is told. And by keeping stories suppressed, you don't find the unity, you don't find that connective thread that can pull us all together. And so I do have a problem in trying to educate the educators about what our universal stories are, and not dusting over a part of it in order to bring a specific culture, specific cultural experience. So I think we do have a lot more work to do, not just within each other individually, but people who are in positions of authority and education have a greater responsibility to really unify those threads and make us all understand that we are fighting a bigger picture and not each other.
Mm-hmm. Incredibly important. It's interesting how history is learned in this country. And I think if you live in places where you have living, very active communities and schools and pueblos and other states, reservations, and get to experience folks who are with us, and I like to speak in present tense and make sure we're remembering there are, you know, living nations of people that are with us. That really didn't feel present on the East Coast. I feel like when I moved to California, that was the first time that I was living in close proximity and being able to learn, and thankfully in welcoming communities where I was able to ask questions and to learn about the Kumeyaay people in San Diego. And it wasn't until I was at the California African American Museum when they had they had a Buffalo Soldiers exhibit. And I had literally only learned of that as, at one, as for positive, at two, in Gwen's language, as a necessary thing. And then hearing the tension to the show and realizing that for Native communities, it was just one additional harm happening. It didn't really matter who was coming, it was an additional harm happening, whereas it was an opportunity for the folks who were serving as Buffalo Soldiers. And I had literally only, as a Jamaican and as a New Yorker born here, I had literally only heard of it as a positive. And so it was in being in that show in LA and kind of hearing the tensions and thinking more of it in that context that I really began to understand so many of the complexities of the solidarity. And I think Robin's point of the educators having a big role in it, those of us who are art and culture bearers having a big part of having some of that conversation. In New Mexico, I've received several positive experiences working with artists, knowing people in community. and then one or two, or a few that were not positive. And I think trying to have a sum total of what that feels like is, one, to honor the complexity, two, to take people as they come, and realize while there is space for solidarity, putting any pressure on either of those two groups is not something I'm finna do. Both groups have had a ridiculous experience in this country, and if folks don't want to talk to each other, folks don't need to talk to each other. If folks who want to work on building a bridge, go ahead and build. I will hand you a thing, build a bridge, right? I'm not going to fault either side because it is so complex. It is rooted in the ground in a way that lives in our bodies differently for African Americans and for folks from various native tribes and communities. Even like I never lived where there were pueblos. And I said I never lived where places where folks were able to fight and keep their land, right? Like I lived in places where people were pushed to a reservation. And when I lived in other parts, or like that was the history that was taught and more familiar. So living in New Mexico has been incredibly eye-opening to hear that version of the story, to learn and think about the power of the Pueblo Revolt. Because those are not stories that are making it, they're not making it to the history books, they're not making it to even your rogue history teacher who knew all the secret knowledge. They don't have it. And so